Welcome! Before I tell you about this book, I want to recommend you a relaxing game, which is in the link under the description of this video. Thank you for your attention and I wish you pleasant listening. Overview. The COVID-19 pandemic unexpectedly changed the world. In Adrift, 2022, business professor Scott Galloway analyzes a similar time of crisis and change, the decades that followed World War II, and looks at the impact of both on America's present by examining 100 different charts. Galloway builds on his analysis of the post-war and pandemic years to envision the future as well. It's filled with perils and opportunities that range from online dating to international economics, and although it will be challenging to build a better future, it's still possible. America's post-war progress. The United States has advanced toward its goals most rapidly when it has focused on building a solid middle class. After World War II, the country experienced decades of historically low unemployment, robust economic development, and massive infrastructure improvements. Innovative technologies such as the personal computer, mobile phones, and the internet all emerged in the decades after World War II. Millions of families came to enjoy an unprecedented standard of living thanks to improvements in wages, public services, economic opportunity, and the availability of consumer goods. The U.S. still had too many poor people, as well as a few megamillionaires, but for multiple decades in the middle of the 20th century, America's middle class was the envy of the world. Even so, entire communities and generations were affected by poverty and lack of opportunity. Slower economic development in the 1960s and 1970s led to less tolerance for inequality. Post-war enthusiasm and creativity started to wane, and the limits of the civil rights movement's progress illuminated the significant remaining obstacles standing in the way of a truly united States. Anxious predictions about the breakup of the U.S. sparked heated discussion over the direction the country should go. As the COVID-19 pandemic winds down, our exceptional technologies bring with them exceptional externalities that our laws, tax code, and culture seem ill-equipped to handle. There seems to be more preparation for conflict than for finding common ground between disadvantaged voices and an established white patriarchy. Huge wealth has been amassed, yet very few people have benefited from it. Shifting tides in the 60s and 70s. The concept of shareholder value emerged in America in the 1960s and 70s. Share values became the way to evaluate a company's performance. This philosophy became the government's working ethos when Ronald Reagan was elected president in 1980. His signature policy was cutting taxes on the wealthiest individuals and the largest corporations, which led to the biggest federal deficits since World War II. The Reagan Revolution changed the way some Americans view government's role. Before, government was seen as a protector of rights and provider of services. Many now see government as a threat to liberty. The United States invested 2.5% of its GDP potential on infrastructure in 1966. This figure dropped considerably over the subsequent 20 years, reaching 1.3% in 1983. The lack of investment has had practical consequences for working Americans, such as declining road conditions and less access to public transit. Also in the 1960s and 70s, many patients suffering from severe psychological illnesses were abandoned in the wake of a movement to end institutionalized care. The nation's will to defend the defenseless was eroding. On the flip side, the union movement empowered employees after the war. In 1950, the U.S. experienced 424 strikes involving more than 1,000 workers. Labor actions improved working conditions and wages, but a range of factors eventually caused a decline in union power, including corruption and overreaching by the unions themselves. As a consequence, the balance of power shifted from labor to capital. Since the 1950s, U.S. productivity has increased at a remarkably steady rate. However, productivity and wages have decoupled since the mid-70s. Average hourly pay only increased by 9% from 1973 to 2014, despite a 72% increase in net productivity. This left worker compensation at less than half what it would have been if the two had stayed in line. The shift to an information economy benefited the top 1% of highly educated Americans, whose wages increased by 140% from 1979 to 2013, while the rest increasingly struggled to accumulate wealth or benefit from upward mobility in their careers. Moreover, a complex tax code gives large corporations a competitive advantage because they have the resources to exploit it. One favored tactic is offshoring profits by setting up shell companies in countries that have lower corporate tax rates or offer incentives. Around 5% of corporate earnings were stored in offshore tax havens back in 1966. But corporations soon realized the easiest way to increase shareholder value was to avoid taxes. More than a quarter of corporate earnings were being recorded in offshore tax havens by the year 2000. The percentage grew to almost 50% by 2016. Today's world. Compared to 40 years ago, humanity has become much more prosperous, free, healthy, and educated. In 1980, 44% of the global population lacked basic democratic freedoms. The percentage is now below 25%. This progress was made all throughout the world, but America was the driving force. Since 1980, billions of people have been pulled out of poverty, most of them in Asia, by producing goods for the consumer markets of the West. Modern civilization rests on a foundation of unprecedented, once even unimaginable productivity. As a result of post-war reconstruction in Western Europe and the U.S. economy's transition from wartime to peacetime, global GDP doubled in only 10 years. The world produced 20 times more in 1960 than it did during the early 19th century. Then, when the post-war boom's easy profits dried up, the genuine miracle occurred. Global economic output doubled between 1980 and 2004. Now, the globe produces monthly as much as it produced in a whole year back in 1950. Billions of people, in under 40 years, have managed to escape extreme poverty. There are certainly problems with the current global order, but the large scope of our accomplishments is often overlooked. Democracy has been the backbone of America's prosperity and progress on the world stage. The rise of democracy began in the 1940s and continued through the 1970s. Democracy promotes innovation, prosperity, and healthy governance. Maintaining democracy is vital to the health and wealth of America and the world. Moreover, the Internet has increased opportunities for communication, information, and economic growth. The Internet may serve as a breeding ground for misinformation, ransom-seeking criminals, and the darkest corners of humanity, but most of what we enjoy today wouldn't be possible without it. Had it not been for the web, our connection to society would have shuttered along with our beloved storefronts and restaurants during the COVID-19 pandemic. Innovation and education. The Reagan Revolution celebrated the individual, and the average Joe was an effective political prop. Decreased belief in a higher religious entity led people to worship a more modern messiah that manifested in the form of innovators. Technology culture has a particularly strong veneration for pioneers. We are seduced by the capabilities of new technologies and blinded to the risks they present. People used to look up to social activists and scientists who gave them reason to have faith in humanity. Today, they glorify tech entrepreneurs who influence the markets and make billions. The federal government's investment in emerging digital technologies during the 1960s laid the foundation for the unprecedented tech boom of the past 40 years. However, federal funding for research and development as a share of GDP has declined steadily since that golden era, from a peak of 1.9% to 0.7% in 2019. Private investment has filled the breach. Yet leaving the future up to private interests is short-sighted for two reasons. First, private investments are subject to short-term market pressures. Second, because private investment means private ownership, the fruits of this research may not be fully exploited, and it is not subject to the democratic controls of government management. Having education and experience after high school is becoming necessary for many occupations. Unfortunately, college degrees have become more expensive and exclusive than they used to be, which has only intensified inequality. Although access to college has improved for women and people of color, and more people overall are attending college today than in the 1970s, college acceptance rates have declined significantly across the board. To make matters worse, lower-skilled jobs have been sent overseas, and repetitive tasks have been left to computers. Wealth inequity. Today's wealthy elites are hedging their ever-expanding riches against losses in the same markets they profess to support. To be born into wealth has become the new American dream. In a healthy capitalist economy, wealth is always at risk. But today in America, those who have benefited from prior storms have suppressed that gale, stifling creativity and competition. Comparatively, worker pay has only increased 38 times since 1960, while corporate profits have increased 85 times. Companies have started using their profits to buy back shares and increase management compensation, rather than investing in their employees. In 1990, the wealthiest 1% of Americans controlled more than their fair share. Fast forward 31 years, and the distribution of wealth in America has gone from lopsided to dystopian. By 2021, the bottom half of the American population owned barely 2% of the country's wealth, while the top 1% owned about a third. There has been a worldwide widening of the wealth gap as well. The rich have gotten richer by taking wealth from the bottom half of income earners. When societies become intensely unequal, the discontented majority usually rises up. If we continue on our chosen path, this is likely to happen in America. In fact, it already has. The January 6, 2021, insurrection was about feeling disconnected and robbed. Policies that favor the redistribution of wealth from the young to the old have made it increasingly difficult for new generations to establish financial security. For instance, owning a home builds credit, reduces housing costs, and makes a young family feel a sense of pride, belonging, and accomplishment. The home ownership rate in the U.S. peaked before the Great Recession. Since the disruption of the Great Recession, housing prices have skyrocketed. Older Americans reap the benefits of tax-deductible mortgage interest, while younger generations and the less wealthy are stuck paying non-deductible rent. Parents like Galloway's used to travel to the U.S. in search of a brighter future for their children. This was doable in the past. Young people nowadays have had enough. They are less financially secure than their parents were when they were young. Their standard of living has plummeted. Declining economic mobility and opportunity is an illness with symptoms including guilt, frustration, and anger. There are clear symptoms of rising ennui and discontent among young people, particularly among men, who express that in forums on Reddit, memes, and violent demonstrations. The giant of advertising. On January 9, 2007, Steve Jobs took the stage to announce that Apple was making a phone. This was a pivotal moment in the history of the Internet, as it marked the beginning of the shift from desktop to mobile. The twin forces of mobile devices and social media changed everything. In 2010, the average American spent 3% of their awake time on their mobile devices. In 2021, that number was 33%. The explosion of screen time was fueled by advertising. About 98% of the revenue of Meta, the company previously known as Facebook, comes from advertising. The shift transpired within a decade. It was a shift enabled by algorithms, the systems that decide what comes up next on the endless scroll of social media. The digital advertising industry became a cash behemoth. Digital ads now drive 63% of all ad revenue in America, and they've turned advertising into a nearly $250 billion industry. Social media apps like Instagram and Twitter have led to shorter attention spans. 55% of website visits lasted less than 15 seconds by 2014. News outlets had to adjust their headlines to maintain our attention. A story's quality now may be measured by how many times it's been shared, liked, and clicked on. Virality is directly correlated with emotion. The most powerful emotion is anger, which increases virality by 34%. Marriage, childbirth, and population growth. Marriage rates in the U.S. have been on the decline for decades, hitting an all-time low of 5.1 per 1,000 people in 2020. The decline has been most severe among the lowest socioeconomic brackets. Marriage is a significant social institution since it provides us with a practical, emotional, and financial companion. One of the benefits of being married is increased access to social and health support networks. So, not surprisingly, married people tend to live longer, experience fewer strokes and heart attacks, and have a lower incidence of depression. Dating apps are now the favored method for finding a partner, but like any social media algorithm, they have pitfalls and inequities that favor those who are the best looking. Population growth is generally considered a prerequisite for economic growth. But U.S. population growth is slowing due to fundamental transformations. Americans are having fewer children, and we have gradually narrowed the gateways of immigration. Population growth is a function of lifespan as well. We once experienced steadily lengthening lives, but the diseases of despair, drug overdoses, obesity, and suicide all accelerated during the COVID-19 pandemic, and they are taking a greater toll every year. On top of that, the American promise that we are all created equal is broken from birth. Race, geography, economic status, and more have profound impacts on a child's chances for prosperity, even life. The challenges facing Americas. The U.S. is in decline as a superpower. This is due to fractious regional conflicts, hapless efforts to exercise state power, and corporate and private interests running unchecked. America is now in a bipolar world, with China as the countervailing force. But America is still the preeminent power in the world. American enterprises account for the majority of the world's largest 100 companies. The U.S. has more billionaires than any nation, and American goods and services account for almost a quarter of the world's GDP. Moreover, the U.S. dollar accounts for almost 60% of global currency reserves. Economic interdependence is a significant factor in swaying political power. Before the year 2000, the U.S. was the primary trade partner for the vast majority of countries, but China surpassed it at the turn of the 21st century. Now, China has become the biggest trading partner for 3 times as many countries as the U.S. Additionally, the U.S. defense budget is over a third of the world's total defense spending. However, when military spending is adjusted for local price differences, America looks far less dominant. America's unrivaled defense spending and economic influence once meant it could project power so effectively that it largely won without fighting. Time has changed that, and America now seems to be fighting everywhere without winning, despite its enormous budget. And America's budget wasn't enough to protect against its greatest recent threat, COVID-19. The Centers for Disease Control had roughly what equaled 1% of the defense budget to respond to a pandemic that has killed more Americans than all of our 20th century wars combined. The U.S. was once a global role model for democracy and freedom, but the general public of the world had a far more negative impression of America by 2020. It was widely believed that American democracy had regressed. Finally, America has long dominated the rankings of the largest 50 companies as measured by market capitalization. However, in the past decade, China's share has increased from 0 to 8 companies, while the U.S. only increased from 30 to 32 companies on the list. There also has been a dramatic growth in the number of wealthy people in China. As of 2021, the country had 626 billionaires, more than twice the total of 2020. This trend is likely to continue, as China's economy continues to grow at a rapid pace. Opportunity within crisis. Human history is full of crises. The challenges we face today highlight how much we stand to lose. There have been far darker times, but light always returns. When it does, it illuminates new opportunities, paths forward that were once barred by entrenched interests or outdated thinking. Entering the workforce during a recession can lead to increased job satisfaction, according to a study. Economic instability can cause us to reevaluate our expectations and be more inquisitive. We become more motivated and productive as well as more satisfied with our work. Future consequences. The U.S. has more people, resources, and infrastructure than ever before. Accelerating change might help us or hurt us, but its effects are hard to predict. Governments have a unique way to generate funds, by printing more money. Many people fear that this approach causes inflation, but some economists disagree. When combined with a government job guarantee and other measures, this philosophy is known as modern monetary theory. Ideally, the new money fuels productive economic activity, which creates value sufficient to absorb the additional currency, holding off inflation. The U.S. government has twice resorted to aggressively expanding the money supply after the 2008 financial crisis and again after the COVID-19 pandemic. In the short run, it appears to have worked. The COVID recession was shorter and shallower than anyone predicted. But the recovery has also been accompanied by inflation. By late 2021, it was clear that inflation was on the rise.
Some inflation isn't disastrous, but hyperinflation can destroy economies.
It may be that modern economies are not subject to this risk in the same way early industrial societies were, however. The ironic effect of technology's connective power is that it allows us to be farther apart. Additionally, the COVID pandemic has had a dark side in terms of the dispersion it has caused. Without the right investments, this dispersion will continue and deepen, with people becoming increasingly isolated, which puts them at risk of losing their ability to tolerate and connect with one another. People are also at risk of becoming slaves to the devices they use to stay connected. Afraid, agitated, and bent over their computers, people are nervous and overworked. They now have less friends, and especially close friends, than they had 30 years ago.
Finding solutions.
Part of the solution for problems of the future is to reset our assessment of what got the world to its current state.
For starters, the tax code is too complex.
Poor people can't afford the assistance needed to navigate the system.
We should revise the tax code with uniform definitions and eliminate itemized deductions in favor of higher standard deductions.
Moreover, regulatory systems are underfunded and inefficient, leaving workers and families unprotected. To fix this, we must reinvest in fair, efficient enforcement to prevent monopolies from suppressing innovation and competition. A 1996 law has mainly shielded social media firms from supervision. Today, over 50% of the world is a social media user. People are immersed in an environment where anger-inducing algorithms thrive, creating fertile ground for mutual distrust, political division, and ideological extremism. Social media companies no longer need special treatment. They now have the resources and reach to play by the same rules as every other media company and should be treated as such.
Another critical problem is poverty. In 2019, nearly 1 in 7 American children lived in poverty. This is bad for the kids and for the U.S. as a whole. Giving every child a solid start in the world, food, shelter, education, and hope is the best investment we can make in our future. The simplest way to aid children is also one of the most effective: give the parents money.
Furthermore, the government's response to the COVID pandemic has resulted in a massive transfer of wealth from the young to the old. More than $3 trillion in stimulus funds were improperly distributed. If the stimulus had been targeted at those who needed it the most, it would have been more effective in repairing the economy. For the majority of colleges, which educate the vast majority of students, we need a grand bargain.
Public subsidies and state funding should be increased, but directly linked to an obligatory expansion of freshman seats. We could also draw innovators into the space by leveling the playing field and abolishing the accreditation cartel.
The path to prosperity does not lie solely in higher education, however. Professional certifications that provide job-ready skills in a shorter period of time can minimize the costs associated with entering the workforce. A social species. If the human race were to severely socially distance for 29 years, a blink of the eye in history, the species would go extinct. Without relationships, communication, and institutions, we are not even mammals. Human contact is fundamental. Less sexual activity is being reported among American youth. Besides being enjoyable and controversial, sex is a key to establishing the elemental foundations of any society, relationships, and families. Conversation comes before any kind of interaction. As a result of our increasingly crude language, the fastest growing forms of communication are having the opposite effect of what was intended. They are boosting polarization and turning friends into foes. But things seem to be getting better. The West seems to be more united following the invasion of Ukraine. Science and medicine are making new discoveries, and remote jobs and education programs have opened up new opportunities worldwide. This has propelled us closer to progress towards a better world.